Thank you. We are now recording. Sorry.
Okay. Again, for the record, thank you, Lou, for handling the Zoom portion, to Scott, Thomas for handling the in the room. Appreciate everybody who's here in person and online. That the title for this lesson in the workbook is Technology Denial and U.S.-China Rivalry. I have subtitled that Old Wine in Leaky Bottles. This is not a new phenomenon. That the probable trigger for the Foreign Policy Association to have commissioned the article to put it in the series is the amount of attention mainly in Washington and in newspaper commentary that is keyed inside the Beltway on the heightened, almost hysterical importance of protecting U.S. technological advantages, the technology edge as a basis for military security, economic competitiveness, and quality of life, and specifically protecting it from threats from China. I'll say more about what they are, but over the last 5 or 6 years, starts about the time of the Trump administration, but it's not, this one is not because of Donald Trump. It's because we didn't have a better way to organize thinking about international relations. I will intend to talk about that. First, though, a little background on the perspective I bring to this, that in the late 70s, I was on the advisory panel for the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. And our task was to rewrite the Export Control Act that expired in 1979. Export controls go back to the end of World War II, were one of the Cold War instruments of containment of the Soviet Union, and restricting access to technology was a way in which we were going to capitalize on American advantages in that area. Decades later, in the early 2000s, I was put in charge of the analytic portion of CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It was the flip side of export controls. How do we protect our technology by not allowing problematic companies or countries buy into American firms? Acquisition and merger decisions. Then almost 4 years ago, I was named to yet another panel. This is from the National Academies of Science, Science, Engineering, and Medicine, a congressionally established panel to look at science, technology, and national security. Same problem. How do we protect America's technological edge? How do we protect it from foreigners in general, Chinese in specific? It's probably worth noting that my appointment to all of these had nothing to do with my work on China. It had to do with other things that I'd done in my background. So I have 2 objectives this evening. The first is to explain and in a minor way critique U.S. policy intended to protect what we have and hobble competitors by limiting, restricting, controlling access to technology. The second is to put those policies into the larger context, that they only make sense really if understood in the larger bundle of first Cold War policies and now in the current era, policies to meet the challenges of the renewal of great power rivalry, as it's called. I will explain all of these. If there's time left, I'll talk a little bit about the mandate and the findings so far of the National Academy's Roundtable, of which I'm a part. But let me go back to the future here to begin. That those of you who've been attending Great Decisions programs for years, I've been doing them for more than 30, that China is a recurring subject. Every 2 or 3 years over that period, there's a China article. That it's there because it's important, and it's there because episodically it rises near the top of the US foreign policy agenda. So by the criteria the Foreign Policy Association uses, China is a habitual offender or a recurring partner or an opportunity to work together on the world stage. It's there because it matters, that all countries matter at some level. But China's size, the size of its economy, the size of its military, the size of its nuclear arsenal, the size of its trade, the size of its foreign exchange holdings, that on almost any dimension normally used to assess the relative power and influence and importance of countries, China is in the top 10, if not the top 2 or 3, behind us on most things, not everything, but on most things. It's also in the series often, and certainly this year, because of specific actions, that in an earlier talk, which I don't assume everybody has remembered, but won't repeat in any detail, I observed the beginning about 2009, 2010, the Chinese became very concerned about the intersecting influences of slowing growth rates. 2007 was the apex of their miracle growth. It's been declining every year since 2007. The image of China is still growing at double-digit rates. It was going to overtake the United States by now, by 2030, but it keeps being pushed out because as big as our economy is, even though we grow more slowly, China can't close the gap on it. But about 2009 or 10, the vulnerabilities that they saw inside their own country, unable to meet demand, needs, expectations for sustained development, sustained improvement in living standards, that was seen as a problem. More importantly, it was seen as a problem that the United States would exploit. That we would exploit their economic weaknesses, we would exploit the myriad groups and contacts that we had developed with lawyers to lawyers, bureaucrats to bureaucrats, academic institution, academic institution. All of these were seen as points of vulnerability. China began to disengage from them. They became convinced that the window of opportunity that the United States opened for China in 1978, Carter administration, when China embarked upon a new policy reform and opening, we said, this is a great opportunity for us to strengthen China as a partner in the never-ending, as expected then, Cold War with the Soviet Union. Having a partner is better to have a strong partner than a weak partner, better to have a rich partner than a poor partner. We applied to China basically the same formula that we had with Western Europe, with Japan, with Korea, and it had the same effect by and large. 2009 or so, the Chinese became convinced that we were going to close that window. maybe immediately, maybe it did take a while, that what happened during the Trump administration when he declared the need to decouple from China, condemned the previous policies, the policies of the previous 8 administrations, that proved to the Chinese that they were right, that we would cut this off. Part of the response to that was to try to gain access to as much American scientific knowledge, technology as possible before the window closed. And they did a number of things that are not all that dissimilar to things we've been doing for 70 years. We capitalize on the brain drain from other countries. We bring people to the United States, we educate them. Many of them stay and get a PhD, and then they get a green card and they go to work in American universities and firms. And they are critical, actually, part of our science and technology engineering infrastructure. So they sent a lot of people, encourage them, threaten them, coerce them to return, develop programs to reward, entice, come to China, come back to China to outfit a lab, we'll pay you a lot of money. They weren't getting a lot of takers, but this multi-dimensional program clearly targeted at taking advantage of the openness and collaborative character of science in the United States. Going back to our own post-World War II policies, we're capitalizing on our military edge, our economic edge, and our scientific edge. There's a part of the whole raft of policies for our own development, for building friendships along the way. And one illustration of that is the Soviet model was to build lots and lots of tanks or airplanes or submarines. So we didn't go that way by and large. We still were going to build better, more technologically advanced to deal with their numbers on it. And that was the underpinning of Silicon Valley, the military industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, that proved remarkably effective and successful as a strategy. Others have figured that out. Not just the Chinese, but certainly to include the Chinese. So the quest for building a technology infrastructure, accelerating scientific development, getting the results into the economy, into advanced industries, into the defense sector is there. And part of this they've tried to keep hidden, not exactly secret, but not publicized. And others, they're out front proclaiming what they're doing. One of the things that they declared they were doing, the head of the party gave a speech and declared that all ethnic Chinese, anywhere in the world, whatever their nationality is now, should remember that they have an obligation to the mother country. And part of that obligation was to bring back advanced science and technology to speed the modernization and ensure the defense. All that's public. One could not have imagined a better statement to trigger the Pavlovian paranoia in our country. And we reacted as crazily as any social scientist who knows about the United States would predict. We got to stop all of this. That we're going to lose our advantage, not just with the Chinese, but with everybody. The basis of our whole industrial scientific interaction between federal funding from the national, all of this was thought to be at risk. That's all part of the background for why is this subject in the workbook this year. What the Chinese have declared they're doing in science, what they've declared they're doing in modernizing, expanding their nuclear forces and conventional force buildup, in trade interference, a lot of things that warrant, need policy responses from the US. All of that is the larger context for the protect technology dimension. That the final sort of framing condition or observation here is it's not all about China and other rapacious foreigners and trying to take. A lot of this is about us. It's what those of us, the age of people in the room anyway, would recognize as a pogo problem. The alligator from Okefenokee, we've met the enemy and it's us. The lack of confidence in us, in our own system, in the people, native born or naturalized Americans working in this, is incredible. It's hard to figure out where it comes from, but it's much the same as all the polling that shows Americans are fearful of the economy. The economy is in bad shape. And let's go, how can 3.6% unemployment be bad shape? How come the highest start markets ever be in bad shape? But both are true. The economy is in very strong shape and people think it's not. So this fear of vulnerability that I identified for the Chinese in 2000, it's here as well. And part of we have to protect by limiting, by putting on controls, is because of lack of confidence in ourselves. Now, the United States, indeed the whole world, has been adrift since the end of the Cold War, since the demise of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union broke up in December of 1991. It took about a decade to recognize or conclude it was really dead, that the stake had been put through the heart of this evil empire and it wasn't coming back in its form. So there was about a decade of, we don't want to give up the policy set, the approaches, the techniques that we used to not lose the Cold War. But we got into a period of another couple of decades where we were kind of drifted. We didn't, there was no name for the period. It's the post-Cold War era. We're now 30 plus years into the post-Cold War era without a good replacement concept, without a good replacement strategy for dealing with the multiplicity of challenges that exist in a much more complex world than existed in the late 1940s. About 5 years, 6 years ago, somebody, I have no idea who, whether it was a clever speech writer for a politician, a op-ed writer, an academic, but declared that we had entered a period of renewed major power competition. This was to take us back to an era that existed long before World War I, certainly World War I. But what did it actually mean? And it's evolved as we don't have a good replacement for Cold War policies, so let's substitute China for Soviet Union, and we can do the kind of stuff that we did that worked so well over that period. That's intellectually lazy and it's politically sleepwalking with inertia. And the policies that ranged everything from the export control kind of thing to controls on access to universities by people from certain countries, to the subsidies for particular industries in the United States, Those who had been receiving subsidies, understandably, for 50 years didn't want to give them up. And others have sought to capitalize on the possibility of more. So all of that stuff comes together as the context and the trigger. That the search for an alternative to the Cold War, to containment policies, containment, very much oversimplified, but it assumed that that Soviet Union would ultimately collapse as a result of its own weaknesses and shortcomings. We didn't need to do aggressive stuff to make that happen. We simply had to deny them opportunities to deal with their weaknesses. And they'd fall of their own. And George Kennan's associated with it. It turns out to be an accurate diagnosis. Policies, technology controls, for example, that made some sense with the Soviet Union with that assumption. We have the opposite assumption about China. I think incorrectly, but the opposite assumption is this is a peer rival of the United States. It's a juggernaut. Unless we stop it, it's going to displace us at the top of the global system. So the starting point is quite different. That one is, all we have to do is limit interaction and it'll collapse. Another one is, unless we do something to stop it, it's going to overtake us in there. I think it's fundamentally wrong, but that's part of the mindset. But it comes up in the context of marked change in American public opinion. That support for the policies of the Cold War, American policy, was really pretty strong and weren't really debated very often until about a decade ago, when ordinary American voters began to say, Cold War's been over for a long time. Why are we still doing the things that we did during that period? And the kind of things that they had in mind was assuming a disproportionate responsibility for maintenance of international peace and stability, maintenance of the global order. And it was pretty simple. The logic of the Cold War, we don't want little conflicts that could spread into big conflicts that could involve us in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. If we didn't have stability, couldn't get the economic growth that we saw as critical for us, for the world, we're going to use our economic strength to strengthen other countries because we'd benefit as well as they. But we assumed, we instituted policies that allowed asymmetric access to American markets, American finance, American institutions of higher education. We did not demand of others what we offered to them. It was very deliberate, take advantage of our strength that I mentioned earlier, the brain drain, the opening up our institutions to the best and the brightest around the world. And historically, most of them have stayed here. That if you look at some of the indicators, how important are they? Roughly half of the American winners of the Nobel Prize are foreign born. More than half of the entrepreneurial ventures in this country are started by immigrants. The source of ideas and ambition that is there is terribly important. But we've asked, why do we give other countries advantages that they don't give us? That shows up most markedly with China. It's not that China is the worst actor out there, it's that it's the biggest. If Mali or Bolivia sort of exploits this asymmetric economic advantage, good for them. It doesn't really hurt us. And China's got almost 5 times as many people as we do, has an economy that is about 2/3 the size of ours. So scale makes a difference. A small percentage of a large number doing untoward, illicit things to acquire American know-how produces a noticeable problem. That if the same fraction of Danes or Israelis or Italians did that, it'd be a little noise in the system, but it's not as problematic. It's simply because of the size of China. So it stands out. And it is cause for more attention. That another aspect of the world is that most countries kind of key off the United States in formulating their own policies, whether it is assuming that the United States would step in under NATO in support of Ukraine, that we will do something with Israel to stop the destruction in Gaza, that we will do something because the Russian blockade of Odessa kept Ukrainian grain from going to Africa, that the assumption is that we will do something. The assumption is that we will be providing leadership in the international system. Being in that position has certain advantages, but our public is saying, why are we still doing that? Why are we the only ones that take this kind of responsibility for a system from which everybody benefits? And yeah, I resist the temptation to run through in any detail the different ways we've attempted to transfer or to share responsibility. That George H.W. Bush, an immediate end of the Cold War, tried to do it with turning the bipolar rivalry into a bipolar partnership. That we and Moscow together would kind of manage the world. It didn't work. Clinton tried to make the UN system designed to prevent another world war and another Great Depression by sharing things through the United Nations structure. There were more UN peacekeeping missions in the Clinton administration than the whole rest of the history of the United Nations. It didn't work. It didn't work. It was too limited, too late, that the rest of the world, what's the preference? You put up some money and you put up some troop, or wait for the Americans to do it? Wait for the Americans to do it. That was the basic problem. Unloading sole responsibility proved to be difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm echoing somebody else's question. Why did George Herbert Walker Bush's outreach to the new Russia, why did that fail?
The question was, why did Bush 41's effort to do a bipolar or the Russia-US partnership, a G2 to rule the world, too much of our own country and too much of other countries were too distrustful of Russia. Russia was seen as a problem. That it came up with, would Russia be eligible for admission to NATO? And the Europeans were having none of it. So from that point, which was very early in the put together the new puzzle, Yeltsin took umbrage at not being good enough to join the club aspect. That Obama tried the unfortunate slogan, leading from behind, right? If we don't step forward, somebody else will. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. The Europeans took the lead in going into Libya, to oust Muammar Gaddafi. And in a matter of weeks, they had run out of ammunition and run out of intelligence, and the country had gone into chaos. And once again, we felt compelled to get involved. So it wasn't for want of trying other things. It was for want of coming up with a workable, viable alternative to the old policies of the Cold War. So we're back into them. We're not in another Cold War. That slogan or that characterization is wrong, but the techniques we're trying to use are familiar ones. The world is so different than it was in the late 40s and early 1950s, when that just one simple, what I think pretty compelling, there's 140 more countries than there were at the end of World War II. And we now have an ethos of democracy, that all the countries ought to get a say in what happens in the world. They're not so eager to take responsibility for what happens in the world. And that plays out in the debate that comes up every year in the meetings around climate change. Industrialized countries put all this carbon in the atmosphere. Rich countries have the responsibility for cleaning it up and for paying for developing countries to find green and clean ways. Otherwise, you're slowing their development to keep them poor. And every meeting, there are new commitments that are not met. But it's an understandable issue. And, you know, American voters seem not real enthusiastic for paying money to clean up India or China or much of Latin America or Africa, that we've got plenty of domestic demands for resources. And we've paid for the other guys long enough. We got to take care of ourselves. It's just a part of the political reality. So we've got this Back to the Future framework that substitutes China for the Soviet Union. And piece of that is protecting science, protecting new technologies, moving rapidly from the laboratory into production scale of things. And since the ecosystem, the system, it's been remarkably open. Most of the research is unclassified. It's going to be published. It is published. It's open to international collaboration. Decades ago, the US was clearly the best in the world in everything. We're not anymore. We're still the best in the world, but we're not the best in the world in everything. And we've been training people from around the world for 50 plus years. A lot of them stayed here, some went home. So there are centers of excellence in lots of countries, including, you know, medical capabilities, biological research in otherwise pretty poor developing countries. They've concentrated on something that really matters to them. So it's not just a nice thing to do anymore. It's necessary to be engaged with people around the world to complement the capabilities that we have. I head to Washington tomorrow for something that involves the International Virus Network. There's 23 countries involved in that, and it's all part of the investigations that enabled us to get a vaccine quickly on COVID. That it's not all here anymore. The model of the Manhattan Project still to build the nuclear bomb. Federal money, right? There wasn't a bunch of scientists that scrambled around for a couple of bucks. Massive infusions of federal money, large numbers of people, a sustained effort to develop the technologies. That one was done in secret, by and large. Some of the secrets linked out, but the government funding linked to security needs, linked to defense needs. Piece of the Manhattan, a whole lot of those scientists were not native born. They'd fled Europe because of the Nazis, and contribute. So you've got this mix of open to outsiders, federal funding, defense links. The model that we adopted of trying to be better technologically really started in the area of weapons that will build fewer and better. And we built up defense industries that existed primarily to serve security requirements. A lot of them in the Valley started that way. But by about 20 years ago, many companies decided to get out of the defense business. Because you build something for the military, it's going to be used for decades. You got to keep supply lines open. You got to maintain inventories. And the technology was changing much too fast. So it was a drag on commercial applications and fast turnover. So we no longer really have much of a defense industry in the United States. We have lots and lots of companies that contract and produce components, and a lot of those components are not in the United States. I remember going back a few years, again, when I was on this congressional thing. So what are some, we asked, what are some examples of fundamental things that we don't make in the United States? And the first answer that came back was fasteners. We made no nails, rivets, screws, or bolts. Say, okay, we can figure out how to make nails again. But the point is, for commercially sensible things, things spread all over the world. Where it was comparative advantage, said they should be built. This very different world with so many more players, and so many more players that have advanced or complementary capabilities. The Cold War cut them off. Don't allow them to study in our universities. Don't sell them critical technologies. You see that what's a critical technology? In the 1970s, a serious bunch of people trying to figure out, what do we control? And part of that effort was headed by the president of Intel. So let's start in the semiconductor, advanced electronics world. By the time, every attempt to write regulations, by the time the regulation to control something was done, that technology had ceased to be cutting edge. So you couldn't keep up with it. Stopping Keystone Technologies proved to be an idea that was clever, but absolutely impractical to implement. Now the slogan is, we're going to have a very small yard with a very high fence. Inside the yard would be the technologies we really need to protect, and we really need to protect them. So the high fence, same thing. What's the technology? Protecting from who? How do you do it completely in American facilities with American citizens? That there's no way to get to that goal, or at least none that anybody has figured out. But the denying access still has appeal with respect to China. The interaction with the Soviet Union was almost zero. That you could count on your fingers and toes the maximum number of Soviet students that ever came to the United States at the same time. From China, it's 360,000 today here. You know, the magnitudes are hugely different. The production and supply line revolution made possible by computers that made it possible to disaggregate production process and go wherever comparative advantage suggested was best to do. That revolution started at the time that China was really the only game in town as a country with large pools of cheap labor and no fixed costs to amortize before they could be brought into the modern production chains. So we've got lots and lots of American firms and American allied firms that have a piece of the supply line in China. So the idea, well, disengage. Really? What company wants to disengage if that means losing money? If that means having to start over someplace? If that means having to pay more for something? Now, there's a lot of movement out of China by companies, not because of US government policy, but because lots of other countries are now in the game. So the electronic stuff is moving to Vietnam. Other stuff is, the textiles are moving to Bangladesh. That it's just moving around, not just Asia, but the world in there. So things are happening that are not connected to policy, but for some, it's the same problem, right? China is a bigger problem, but putting it all in Vietnam, that's not such a good idea either for those that want to insulate everything from interference. That the policies that we adopted that favored certain sectors of our economy, places of our country, that and which is easy to understand, Boeing. We used to have several manufacturers of airplanes, Douglas, Lockheed, Grumman, that made airplanes. Now it's pretty much not just airplanes, it's airplanes and missiles. That is Boeing. And Boeing produces competitive airplanes because it's highly subsidized. We don't subsidize the manufacture of passenger aircraft. That's what we criticize the Europeans for doing with Airbus. We award defense contracts to build cruise missiles. Boeing's got the money to build passenger aircraft in there. This is all fungible. It's all interconnected. So trying to come up with a systemic way to deny China or anybody else access is without denying ourselves the things that we think are necessary to our own security and prosperity is about impossible. One more thing on the interconnected is the Justice Department, starting under the Trump administration, that had something called the China Initiative. And it basically assumed all Chinese were guilty until proven otherwise. It spun up a lot of anti-Asian sentiment in the country. You see, China, yeah, it's a problem, and it's a bad guy in some respects, but it's not the only one. The Russians are just as eager to get at a lot of this stuff, but the Russians don't send any students and scholars here, and we don't do joint ventures with the Russians much. We still doing some. We still pay billions of dollars a year to Russia for them to, in Tennessee, convert nuclear weapons fissile material in the fuel for power plants. They do it much cheaper and much more efficiently than we did. So we do that, but that hasn't been cut off because of Ukraine. Because even that outrageous stuff is hard. But there are no Russians here anymore. Lots of Russians in Israel. Do we cut off Israel? Deny them access? Of course not. The Iranians don't come here anymore, but the Iranians who don't like this regime that flee elsewhere, and they're mostly talented intellectuals, they're all over Europe. Is one or two of those maybe a bad guy that's there, that a German scholar comes, he's working with an Iranian colleague? There's no way, and the point is to insulate us from the world. No practical way to do it. Let me go to the great power growth and then the run faster or hobble choice. That China's decades of miracle growth, double-digit growth, created the image in China and outside that this would go on forever. So a lot of the fear of China and lack of confidence in ourselves is predicated on a judgment that China is still growing at this double-digit rate. It's not. It's declared a growth target of 5% for this year with 3% inflation. So that's growth of 2%. That 2%, at 2% growth, they fall further and further behind us if we grow at 1%. And we'll grow at 1% pretty easily in here. So we've got a declared rival that is not a peer competitor. We've got an image or a narrative in the US that China's great success is primarily the result of foolish, naive US policies. We created the monster by giving them access to our markets, our financial capabilities, our universities. That narrative is wrong, but it is a part of what undergirds this effort. It plays out in specific things like the Chips and Science Act. This is, I've forgotten the number of billions of dollars earmarked in this to do increased and advanced manufacture of semiconductors in the United States. We don't make many here. It's just cheaper to make them other places. And they've gone other places. We're building Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is the largest and most advanced maker of chips in the world, is building a multi-billion-dollar facility in Arizona. And they keep pushing back the opening date. Not for construction problems, they can't find workers. We train so few STEM students in this country that we can't provide the workforce that these factories will need. But the subsidies, the industrial policy approach that is embodied in the CHIPS Act, Chips and Science Act, is favored by certain industries. It's favored by the parts of the country where they are located. It will become like the oil industry, like the aircraft industry, other components of traditional defense that have almost a regular line item in the United States budget in the name of strengthening American self-reliance, avoiding with the vulnerabilities of dependence. It's not a bad idea, but it kind of bumps up against reality. And you say, why is it that the companies in the United States didn't decide on their own to build things in Tennessee or Arizona or wherever it is? Because they're in the business of making money. So the impulse that they have, the incentives they have, is to go where you get the best return. That's different from getting the most secure production lines for the United States. So we've got a set of policy, we're adopting a set of policies that aren't suitable for the era we live in, probably can't work because they've got to be administered by private sector actors who will demand incentives that they'll get some and they won't get others on this. What seemed like a simple idea, we got to protect our technological edge, turns out to be at least as hard and probably much harder than it was when we decided to do that in the 1940s. 1949 was the first of the export control actions. And it's already playing out in really silly ways. That the state of Florida has passed a law that no Chinese students can study in a Chinese university and no Chinese can buy farmland in Florida. And you go, what the hell's that got to do with national security? But it demonstrates to Chinese who are here, who have no nefarious intent, that we are discriminatory against them, and because the whole world watches us, we get a black eye because of that. Even if it's not directed at most other countries, there is a, if you do it to them, they can do it to us. So maybe we ought to not hook our wagon to the American locomotive. We'll connect in the technology arena elsewhere. I'm going to stop. I'm not going to talk about this until I want to open up to questions. I have plenty of time for questions. Are there any online, Lou?
Yes. Marcia Sterling has, well, it's about 10 lines, so here we go. Tom, it's a mystery to me how completely we've lost confidence in ourselves as world leader. To some extent, I think it's healthy. That is, acknowledge that we're not really morally superior to the rest of the world. But these days, everybody believes the other half of the country is not only crazy, but also evil.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, no wonder people are questioning whether we should be a role model for the rest of the world. More of a comment than a question. Just any response?
Yeah, I will respond. Thank you, Marcia, because the observations are correct. That having traveled around the world a lot in my career, the extent to which other people in other countries look at us, sometimes look to us, but look at us, that we are thought to be more important than we ever were, than we probably want to be. One of my colleagues, when I was traveling with him in South Asia, and we were experiencing lots and lots of commentary on the States, and he says, you got to understand, in this part of the world, they think we make it rain. And if the monsoon doesn't come, it's because we did something. That the assumption that we are so omnipotent as to control the fate of people everywhere. And that kind of worked to our advantage when the world thought we knew what we were doing. Increasingly, we do things that persuades the ever better educated folks all around the globe that we may not know what we are doing. and our domestic politics and the way it plays out and the universalization of social media contexts and stuff, that the craziest stuff that, you know, most of us as Americans reckon that's crazy, that's minority, that's, if you're on the outside, it looks like a part of America, and it is a part of the American fabric. This matters, I think, in terms of our international influence in at least two ways. One is, again, my perception is, since the end of the Cold War, even after we got over our triumphalist phase of we won, it's a unipolar world, and we can manage everything and make it peaceful and good. Before we failed in our effort to do that, that the default position for lots of people and lots of countries is they'd like to see the Americans get their comeuppance. That if only there were somebody else that they could look to as a model, as a source of training, for investment, for security. So we are resented in part because we actually fall short of our values and ideals, because we become an uncertain provider of security, global security, because we are making changes that make us less open to their products or partnerships and the like. The normal tendency for countries, smaller countries, mid-sized countries, non-big great countries, is to try and find a way to protect their own interests by balancing the capacities and presumed intentions of the United States with somebody else. For decades, that was the Soviet Union, the socialist camp. In the immediate post-war, a little bit of that was Japan and Western Europe. Now there is an image that this is China, that countries will turn to China if we don't get our own act together, that they'll turn to China because they're tired of the United States acting like a meddlesome mother-in-law and telling them how they ought to organize their education system. And then things, when we spoke with more authority, were more of a role model than a nagging nanny, that we had more impact and more influence. There's a piece of me to say, I don't care how much influence I've got in Mauritania. But I'm not quite willing to go I don't care who else they turn to. I do care who else they turn to. Because there are lots of places that don't share our values, that don't have the same openness and transparency that we do. The final sentence, and it's implicit, I think, in what Marcia asked, the number one challenge for us is to get our own house in order, to take care of our own problems. The bad side is the paralysis in the Congress and the partisanship. And the good part of this is, I think we are paying more attention to social justice kinds of issues in this country, towards equality kind of issues around the world, than we have since the 1970s, where we made progress in the 60s and 70s, and then it stopped or it went backwards. That there are at least some, to me, positive signs in this. And I do think as we start to get our own act together, which we will, I'm sure we will, the predisposition to look to anybody except the Americans will fall away. We'll again become a soft power role model. Maybe I'm Pollyanna, but I believe it. Anybody in the room? Peter?
It's been a very interesting talk. I'm just coming to think of how it's not the people of China that are here, like the scientists and such, but their governing model of sort of subjugating people to laboring away, you know, spending all their energy every day and raising their life's quality a little bit every day, but it's coming from the top, and their governing Communist Party thing is certain kinds of individuals that can go other places if they fail at what they're doing. Now they overbuilt their housing, and you read about these just landscapes of tenement type, like we would do here as urban renewals.
Mm-hmm.
But out in the desert areas and stuff, they'll just build and build and build, and then somehow I don't see how they really give those people the quality of life. Maybe they let them live for free like a Communist Party would, but their quality of self-esteem is not anywhere close to the leadership. So I'm just thinking, when they go to a country, say Nicaragua
Mm-hmm.
or Honduras or Mexico, they could bring the people that do these kind of big developer contracting things and put people to work and raise their level. But it kind of comes back to me to look around here in Redwood City. All these buildings they're saying is for the solving the problem of our disenfranchised adults that can't afford a place to live. They're bringing that model here, and I think racially, the Communist Party is spreading out throughout all sorts of ethnic areas and bringing the attitude here to where we can't think of ourselves as a role model. We're being put in our place because, you know, elder care,
Yeah.
nursing,
Yeah.
all these people are banding together in a communist way.
There is the question from Peter, if it didn't pick up for the Zoom, has to do with the shortcomings in our own society, societal injustice, and the Chinese, the communist system may be making more of an effort to address some of the housing problems, the inequities in the system. Let me focus on the U.S. Lou, is that something that didn't come through?
No, go.
Okay, that a simple, almost simplistic kind of explanation for the types of problems that we have: homeless, inadequate mental health systems, elder care that we've got, goes back to decisions made for Cold War reasons. That survival, avoiding nuclear war, security, not losing the existential competition with the Soviet Union that kind of drove everything, right? Everything else was subordinated to that, which wasn't crazy. Priorities was, but the result is we've got decades of catching up to do in our own system. And one of the things that troubles me most about this resurgence of major power competition model and plugging China into the Soviet Union space is that the logic of it is to continue to relegate the kinds of issues that you correctly point to secondary or tertiary. Now, our education system, primary and secondary education, are poor. And there's no excuse for it being poor, but we've chosen to be among the lowest tax people in the world. Of developing countries, taxes here are lower than any place. And within the money that we spend, we put half of it into defense. And more than half into defense when you count things like the support to privileged industries on it. We need a hard relook at what our priorities are, what our needs are, that the Chinese have done better in some respects. I wouldn't want to be there though, because they've still got, give or take, 700 million people who've been lifted out of abject poverty, but they're nowhere close to the middle class. And the out of abject poverty, you know how much that is? It's $2.60 a day. So they've lifted people out of that, but even in China, $2.60 doesn't buy you much. That the
In the big cities, they'd be out of the pharmacies.
Yeah, but they're not in the farms. Is anybody with that? There's something called the Lewis point in economics. It says the point at which there are no more people who can move from farm to factory. And China has hit that by the economic kind of criteria, that you take any more people out, you're not gonna be able to produce the food that you need. But they're not educated. You know, they've made choices too. And if you are a rural kid, you're almost certainly not going to go beyond junior high school. If you're an urban kid, high school's free. If you're a rural kid, or you're a rural kid that happens to be living in a city because your parents moved there, you're still classified rural. So you've got to pay tuition to go to high school. And as a function of average earnings level, it's the most expensive high school in the world. Say, well, it's only half the young people in the country. Yeah, it's half the young people in the country, but they are connected by social media, by television, by radio, by movement back and forth. They know what their relatives in the city, and they want it. The need for them to do more for elder care, because there's no social security system. So somebody's got to stay home with grandma. If somebody stays home with grandma, you can't have two incomes. If you don't have two incomes, after you've paid your mortgage and your car payment, you're done. These are serious problems. I wouldn't trade them for ours. My point, and it's back to Marcia, we really need to look at the prioritizations that we have established for ourselves and re-look at them, but it's hard. It's hard for all kinds of reasons. I'll give you just one, that we do a huge percentage of the redistribution of this country through the defense budget, right? Getting money to improve education, that's really hard at a federal level, which last time I checked, it's 6% of what we spend on education is through the federal budget. But we subsidize schools all over the country if they've got a military facility. You know, the military comes there, brings extra kids, got to increase the tax base. So we put money into it. I don't have a problem with doing that, or lots of variants of that to keep main streets open, that California paying for Alabama. Okay, we're all one country. But we do it through the defense budget, so we don't have to have the fight about why am I spending money to pay for somebody else's health care in it. So we just hide it in the budget. We ought to face it, and we ought to do the right thing. And then we would be a better model for the world, I would think. Lou, you got somebody?
Yes. First question, how will our weaponization of the dollar pay out, or sorry, play out, I'm sorry. How will our weaponization of the dollar play out?
Short term will be all right. Long term, it's a problem, I think. That by weaponization of the dollar, what I believe the questioner means is our both taking advantage of the fact that we are the currency, the international currency for settling accounts, trade accounts. Almost all trade is denoted in dollars. Among other things, this buffers us from global inflation elsewhere. It doesn't buffer others, but it does transfer our inflation to them on there. That if we're paying in cheaper dollars at home or in our trade dealing, they're paying in more expensive dollars. The weaponization to the use of the global banking system. Virtually all banking translations in the world go through New York. It's just, no, the system got set up, it got started there, it was, it works. Why have a parallel system? So that somebody in Pakistan can transmit money to somebody in Denmark, it's probably going to go through a bank in New York. You know, just handling the conversions of exchange rates, the moving it from one bank to another. It's the numbers that are on the left side at the bottom of your check. All of those numbers, what they mean is that's in the SWIFT system, and that's an American system, and almost everybody is involved in it. That the euro, when it was established, the expectation was that it was going to take a sizable chunk of global financial, and it didn't happen. The yen earlier was expected to take, and it didn't happen. The Chinese have tried to make the yuan, the renminbi, more they've got a lot of problems about it. One, it's a non-convertible currency. So people are reluctant to make it when you can't, there are currency controls on getting it out of the country. The exchange rate is controlled. It's not market driven. So long term, the logic is you build in alternatives to the system to make it more efficient and to keep the Americans from exploiting the advantage. Short term, be pretty hard to disengage from the system. And the problem is to get to the long term, you have to get through the short term. So the long-term goal is reduce the American power, the power of the dollar. But how do you get started? And who wants to run the risk of, not the risk that the Americans will retaliate it, but the risk that you'll set up something that doesn't work? Anybody here in this room? Okay.
Is this on?
Yes.
When you consider that they're trying to build a chip manufacturing in Arizona, and they're trying to do that to reduce our dependence on this whole culture of Taiwan, it seems like it's their culture to be so neat and careful, and those kind of jobs are not something a lot of American kids would hold still for, I don't think. I'm wondering, the building of this complex, it's in Arizona, so they'll use Mexican workers. I mean, it's a state that's full of senior retirement. You know, there's an idea there that seems like it wants to kind of slap a friend in the face that's been helping us all through the tech world, you know? I don't like to think that you have to make any big decisions like that, but I know that in my subconscious, I think most of our young people want to go to work with a
Mhm,
hammer and, a foreman and take orders and build something and be accepted into a teamwork kind of experience. And that's what doesn't come out of college nowadays, I don't think.
Peter's observation is the cultural difference, that the kind of the diligence demonstrated by graduates of schools in Taiwan that makes them suitable workers for the advanced semiconductor. And we don't turn out people in the same way. That's a part of it. And they've been doing it for years. Are we capable of doing that? Sure. That if we emphasize different things, provide different kinds of training, but there's also an expectation, and not the Taiwan, but we use the China one as an assembly point for lots of a large number of Taiwan-owned facilities are on the mainland that including Taiwan Semiconductor manufacturing. They're on the mainland, not the most advanced, but they're there. And some years ago, I was consulting for an American high-tech firm. And I asked what the difference in cost was for assembling particular device here and in China. And he said, dime. So the dime, dime. Yeah, American dime, 10% American dollar. And so, well, why do you assemble these things in China instead of here? So, the transportation cost would wipe out that difference. And he said, I can't find 80,000 Americans willing to sit on a 3-legged stool for 12 hours a day and do mindless, repetitive things. That I think it's good that we expect better jobs than that. But those jobs are they're moving away from China. Because that was a fine starter job for the kid that came from the farm. It's not a career job. And they're demanding more money and they're getting more money and they move on to a different kind of job and there's nobody to replace them. So the choices go where you get more cheap labor or mechanize it in some way. In either case, this stuff's going to move around in it. The Arizona, I don't know how much of it had to do with the straight politics of keeping Kristen Sinema on board and voting with the Democratic Party, the senator from Arizona, who would, with Joe Manchin, was the brake on so much of the Biden program. She, now became an independent. Now she's not running. But it can't be that Arizona's got more water or something that is the attraction to put the firm there, the construction project. Let me take, yeah. Corinne?
Well, you've just opened up a can of worms all over the place. So it looks like we have issues, huge issues here with education. Why don't we make it attractive to students to study STEM? And also, why don't we open our borders to people who would be very happy for those assembly jobs?
Yeah, the question for Zoom people is, why don't we make STEM more attractive to American students? And why don't we open our borders for workers who'd be delighted to have these jobs? I don't think there's a good answer. Obviously, we ought to do it. Part of it is we underfund education. We don't pay teachers enough. That, if math or science is an extra duty as assigned to the phys ed teacher, that's probably not going to stimulate the interest in there. That we've depicted as this is hard, this is for the pointy heads kind of thing, as opposed to everybody needs to balance a checkbook kind of approaches to it. That leaving education as the purview of local school districts, which may have made sense a century and a half ago, where you train people for whatever the economic activity was. The grain milling, the paint factory, whatever it was, that sort of made sense. In a highly mobile, move around, fast changing economy, we need to train people with the ability to learn, the ability to adapt. But localities mostly don't want to spend the money. Big chunk of them have an anti-science attitude, which is, no, we're not anti-science, but it's just a theory. It's not like creationism, which is what the Bible says, is the explanation for this. So you get curricula that try to mix it. And how much time can you spend? And all of the other things that we do in schools that used to be done by families that are now assigned to schools to take care of, that doesn't leave so much time. I mean, your opening statement is absolutely right. These are huge problems that we have ignored or for political reasons made a conscious decision not to invoke the wrath of groups of people in mostly rural areas. But that's still a big chunk of our country that is rural and not fighting fights that probably ought to be fought. Robert?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief. Can you mentioned that most all financial transactions wind up going through New York City? But my understanding is there's this BRICS initiative that's an attempt to create a currency similar with a similar function to the dollar, but not the dollar. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I don't know much about it, but it exists as an attempt. And part of it is anybody but the Americans impulse that's out there. That because if you're a small player and you can't counterbalance one big guy against another big, you got no room. You got no protection. You got no agency here in it. So the desire to come up with something is there. The costs of duplicating that capability are high. And it's kind of hard to start small with a replacement for a big global system. That say we're going to try it out between these three countries. Okay, that's a portion of your economic activity. So that's the kind of problem. I think there's a significant desire to find an alternative, even for folks that aren't particularly jealous or hostile to the United States. It's just single point of failure systems don't make sense. That we ought to have something that when New York, as happened with the Superstorm Sandy that flooded the data centers and knocked banking system offline for a while. It's not just New York banks and ATMs, it's the whole bloody world went down for a period. One of the striking things about the magnitude of US hegemony, and that's, I guess, the right word in so many things, is that after the 2008 crash and the 2011, I guess, was the Superstorm Sandy that hit the US share of banking transactions in the world went up. Because we responded quickly, that the policy instruments were used, the banking systems capabilities, the networking kind of stuff, that the kind of the lessons that were drawn were not, the Americans have a fragile system and it broke. It was, holy mackerel, look how fast they responded across the board to address this problem on there.
Tom, we have, some things queued up
Oh,
online.
yes, let me take one here, two there, and then we'll call it a night.
All right.
You mentioned that if we increased our taxes, it would be a big help. But I think that would be a hard sell because people would want to know, well, what are my taxes being raised for?
Mhm.
It's scurrilous that in our country, the single greatest cause of bankruptcies to families is inadequate health care or no health care
Mhm.
for crises at the end of life. To think of people working, being productive during their whole lives only to lose everything at the end is horrifying. So
Mhm.
something is really upside down. On the other hand, we have companies like Caterpillar that stowed $3 billion in Switzerland for the express purpose of avoiding paying their income taxes.
Mhm.
And they were investigated until it was called off under the previous administration by the Attorney General who had been working for Caterpillar.
Mhm.
No problem with conflict of interest there. But how are we going to sort these things out?
The why don't we raise our taxes and the inequities of the tax system that wealthy companies, wealthy individuals can avoid paying taxes? If I had the answer to that question, I'd probably be something other than a Stanford researcher. That, I mean, they're the real challenges that we face. I can't remember where I've seen this figure, but I think it's right, that the deficits that we have, that are a problem, no question that having a deficit, aggregate deficit is roughly 3 times our GDP, is a restriction on what we could do. If we raised our taxes, that what we actually pay here, by 2%, it wipes it all out. I mean, it's not like we got to take half of your discretionary income. But the wealth has become so skewed that the minimal taxes, increases in taxes on ordinary people pales in comparison to what we would have to take from people that now pay much lower percentages because they can hire lawyers and accountants and get the law written in a way. I don't have an answer, but you've identified a critical problem. Lou, can you clump 2 together?
Sure. First of all, kudos from somebody who really liked your quote from Walt Kelly about we have met the
Bogle.
enemy and he is us. So kudos there. And we have some follow-up here relative to that question about weaponization of the dollar. First comment, we sanction folks and misuse our money. And by weaponization of the dollar is using money to sanction nations and people. Do you want to comment on that? I don't really understand the comment, but.
I'm not sure I understand it either, but I'll take a shot at it rather than simply saying, I don't know. Where I've encountered it myself was by fluke. One of my confirmation processes, I was linked to the an undersecretary of the Treasury who was to be in charge of sanctions. Levy was his name. And a lot of it there hinged on reputation, that the knowledge of what banking transactions were, because of the transparency within the system, that before imposing sanctions would go talk to a company that said, we know that you're in essence floating money for loaning, laundering money for some bad actors. It was set up around terrorism after 9/11. And we don't think your customers would feel very happy with you if they knew that. Didn't have to threaten that they're going to release that information, but got compliance. The design was to have a laddered effect of levers to be used to make it less attractive to continue doing problematic things than it was to pay the costs of compliance. I don't pretend to understand how all of this works. I do know that there are enormous numbers of transactions that trillions of dollars per day in transactions that are flowing through this system and are monitoring them. There's common sense that in all of that, there got to be a lot of levers and buttons, that gateways that can be utilized. But I've now said more than I know. And we've run out the clock here on the time. Before turning it over to Lou for closing it out, let me say thanks again to people who asked the questions. Apologies to anybody that asked a question that didn't get addressed. Next week, our speaker on NATO, future of NATO, is Rose Gottemuller, former colleague of mine from the State Department, now a colleague at Stanford. Rose was the Deputy General Secretary of NATO, as well as the Undersecretary of State for International Security and Arms Control. She knows this subject because she lived it until a few years ago. She'll be here next week. Lou, over to you to close this out.
Thanks very much. Just a simple reminder that we will use the same password next week. So make sure you save it to use it again. And our talk is being recorded. We'll have the video later on in the week, probably Thursday or Friday. And thanks to everybody. Tom, big thanks to you. Appreciate, as always, your commentary, your expertise, and all the background you bring. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and then I'll stop the meeting. Thanks, everybody, and have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you.